I'm interviewing Joseph Kishore from the Socialist Equality Party. He's running to be president of the United States in the upcoming election. Very pleased to meet you, Joseph. I've learned about the Social Equality Party through your activism and engagement on what's going on in Palestine. You have had a really strong stance on the issue, an anti-occupation and anti-genocide stance. But you've also linked, I think, the issue to a broader question around US imperialism and also US voting systems and power dynamics in the United States. I think your view is incredibly interesting. So thanks for joining for this interview. So, Joseph, why are you running to be president of the United States?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me for this discussion. And I look forward to addressing many of the issues, including the genocide and its connection to imperialism and the perspective of the Socialist Equality Party. Um, well, to answer your question, I'm running as the candidate of the Socialist Equality Party. My running mate is Jerry White, in order to fight within the working class for a socialist perspective. We explained when we announced the campaign that its aim is to develop an understanding within the working class that none of the problems that we confront, not just in the United States, but all over the world, war, dictatorship, massive levels of social inequality, an ongoing pandemic, climate change, that none of these issues can be addressed outside, and extreme levels of social inequality and exploitation, that none of these issues can be addressed outside of a development within the working class of a movement for socialism. That the working class has to take power, reorganize society on the basis of social need, and not private profit, expropriate the wealth of the handful of oligarchs that control the economy and the gigantic banks and corporations that dictate policy, and that there has to be a socialist reorganization of economic life on a world scale. And that's why we're running.
That makes a lot of sense, although it's quite abstract. These are terms that are well understood to some people and perhaps misconstrued by others. Could you give us a kind of a concrete way of understanding this? So if people are thinking, okay, there's this genocide going on in Palestine, how in what way is that linked to me as a US working class person? Why should that matter to me? Other than the kind of compassion that one might have for people on other parts of the world, but what is the link between these struggles?
Sure. Well, I think that is an important issue. Obviously, young people, workers are seeing what's happening in Gaza and are outraged, horrified by the crimes that are being committed, financed by the United States. Um, I'd make a couple points, though, in response. And this, of course, is a discussion that we have with workers continuously in the course of our campaign, explaining this connection. Uh, the genocide, first of all, is part of a broader war, a war which threatens, in fact, all of humanity. I mean, they are talking about, again, the possibility of nuclear war, the initial stages of a world war. There was a column that appeared in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, which basically confirmed the analysis that we have been making. So, under the headline, World War III has begun. There's a war against Russia. There's a war now throughout the Middle East. And of course, as we are speaking, it's in the immediate aftermath of the Israeli strikes on Iran last night. And there's a developing conflict with China. A global war will have vast implications for all of humanity. And it's the working class that will have to fight in such a war and will die and is dying in such a war. In relationship to the United States, of course, you have a phenomenon in which all of society's resources are being diverted behind war. The United States spends $1 trillion every year on war. It's financing the genocide, but preparing for global war. There was just an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago documenting the massive resources spent on modernization of nuclear weapons. And society is starved. I mean, they say there's no money for public education systems, which are falling apart, the healthcare system, which is in shambles, decent wages.
If I may just quickly come in there, you've reminded me of something that I've been noticing in the United Kingdom, which is that the UK is a staunch ally of the United States, is a sort of a champion of the NATO fraternity, and has been very strong in its support for the Ukraine and denouncing of Russia. And there has been an announcement of an ongoing £3 billion a year package to continue to go to Ukraine from the Socialist Labour Party. And at the same time, they're cutting winter fuel payments to pensioners, and saying that there isn't enough budget. So there is this kind of tendency to have an unlimited war bucket, very little left for the domestic population who end up suffering as a consequence of this constant war mindset. Is that
Well, I
right?
mean, but to make it sort of concrete, these gigantic aircraft carriers, which they're deploying in the Middle East, it costs tens of billions, even more than $100 billion to produce. And if one considers, I mean, what could those resources go to rather than producing instruments of destruction, whose only purpose really is to kill people, to actually utilize the resources of society to meet social need. I
Yeah.
mean, it is extra. I mean, the cutting public school budgets, laying off teachers. There's continuously the refrain, well, there's no money for anything. But at the snap of without a second thought, Congress will pass tens of billions of dollars for war against Russia, for arming the genocide, because that's in the interest of the American ruling class. And I think this is an important concept to really explain that to workers, is that the same ruling class that is waging a war abroad is behind the war on workers at home. The incessant demands for increased exploitation, for layoffs. Boeing, which is an arms manufacturer, major military manufacturer, announced 17,000 layoffs a couple of weeks ago in the midst of a strike, an ongoing strike by workers. And so there is a direct connection. It is the same social class that is waging both wars.
You remind me as well of. So I used to work on autonomous weapon systems. So I was always very concerned about the development of artificial intelligence. And Palestine has been described as a laboratory for testing of new types of killing technology, right? And we've known that artificial intelligence targeting systems have been used to destroy Gaza. But what people don't so much realize is that these technologies are being harnessed for also domestic use. So the same types of surveillance technology that were deployed to target combatants, or in their words, terrorists, or in another language, those part of the resistance in the conflict theatre, those technologies end up getting used against the working class at home. And so, we can see it in border control, these types of weapon systems, but we'll also see it in policing. And so there's this kind of repression going on of those voices that are dissenting to that sort of elite club of people who just make a lot of money from constant warfare.
Yeah, yeah. And they see it as one war. I mean, when Trump speaks about the enemy within, he means the working class, and he's articulating the the conception of the financial oligarchy, that they face an enemy within the United States, and that is fundamentally the working class, and on all opposition to the policies of the ruling class. And it is a class. It's those who own the gigantic corporations and banks, the Wall Street investors. This is the social layer in whose interest government policy is dictated by both parties. And they see this as one war, really, on two fronts. And they're very concerned about the growth of the class struggle within the United States, so this could upend their war plans. There was a dock workers strike that was shut down in 2.5 days. But there were many columns in the papers worried about, well, this is a national security issue, national security, and by which they mean military issue, if workers in the United States are on strike, by disrupting production. I mean, it goes back actually also to the issue of the genocide. At the beginning of the genocide, perhaps you recall, the Palestinian trade unions called for working class action to stop the shipment of materials to Israel, to stop the genocide, a call which we supported, the Socialist Equality Party. Because how is the genocide to stop? Well, I would say, perhaps we'll return to this, in its most fundamental sense, the fight against the genocide is a fight against imperialism and therefore the fight against capitalism. But in terms of the social force that, first of all, can realize that program, but also has the power to disrupt the operations of imperialism, it's the working class.
Right, right.
If workers were, strike action to stop shipments, to stop production, to shut down economic life,
Yeah.
it is the working class which has enormous social power. And the role of the trade union apparatus, the AFL-CIO, of course, it took no action to do anything, and they're deeply tied to the Democratic Party.
I've been racking my head, as along with many others, in the last few months about what is the most effective thing that we could be doing to stop the genocide. And we've had different ideas, different campaigns. One that I had been working on to some extent was to work on an energy embargo against Israel. So it was part of a global coalition of civil society trying to stop states from delivering energy. And it was interesting because the US is supplying jet fuel to Israel. And without that jet fuel, the F-5 and F-16 flights can't take place. So this jet fuel is directly responsible for these bombings. So we learned that there was a ship coming across the Atlantic through the Mediterranean, and we were seeking impact from trade unions, port workers, port authorities to try to disrupt this ship. And it was well, they had such nefarious methods to try to subvert that, and ultimately the fuel got delivered. But it was a strong realization of the interconnectivity and the reliance that we will ultimately have on workers in order to make this stop. Because unless those workers are willing to stop supplying the fuel, this is going to continue. So heavily reliant on workers, but it's also, we're in the same battle as them. We are, if we think about it in terms of a pyramid, we are all at the bottom. People who are workers, or perhaps we need to realize that we just need to walk away from that structure. I actually want to ask you a little bit more. So we've talked a little bit about perhaps what we're against, what we're critical of. What would be a positive alternative? So what does a world in which capitalism, imperialism, genocide, once it's stopped, how do we build a better society? What does that look like for the Socialist Party?
Um, well, capitalism itself is, I think, reached a historic dead end, and it is evident in what is happening. The genocide, I mean, the return of normalization of all the crimes of the 20th century at an even higher level, and it's driving mankind towards disaster. And the whole sort of structure of capitalist society is historically bankrupt. I mean, if you want to talk, well, what would a socialist society, for example, look like? I mean, first of all, we live in a global economy, yet the global economy exists within the framework of a nation state system, which in a sense is the root cause of war. You have nation states representing different interests of different sections of the capitalist class competing over access to resources, raw materials, what is really driving the war. We live in a global economy, but there's a fundamental contradiction between that global economy and the existing nation state system. A social society, first of all, is necessarily international in character. A society based upon global production, global planning, but a society which is based upon production for social need and not private profit. If I could go back to, I mean, there are two basic contradictions of the capitalist system. One is between global economy and the nation state system. And that contradiction or conflict is expressed in imperialist war, the fight of rival capitalist classes for access to resources, control over the world in a fundamental sense. And it goes back to Lenin and Trotsky and the analysis of the great Marxists. That is the root cause of war. On the other hand, you have the conflict or contradiction between social production. You know, in every product, every commodity involves the labor of millions of workers all over the world. And the contradiction between that and private ownership of production, that is, that these corporations are owned privately, production is for profit rather than social need. Socialism resolves those or supersedes those contradictions by establishing a society, one which is based upon global coordination and planning on a world scale, and two, which is based upon social need, democratic control of production. Why is it? It's completely irrational. Why these gigantic forces of production, corporations, which produce things which are necessary for life on the planet, food and energy and everything else, controlled by a handful of corporations for their private exploitation? No, they should be controlled by the working class, run on the basis of social need, democratically, decisions on what is done made democratically by the working class itself.
Yeah.
That is the basic
Yeah.
conception and principle of socialism.
At the core of the struggle that we're all going through at the moment is also a question about humanity and what it means to be human and what values that we protect. What does justice mean to us? And why doesn't it seem to make sense to these people who are fighting on the other side? Is you have like a view on what people who have this view that we're talking about, which we think is the right view, what does it mean for us as humans? You know, what values are we saying are important in socialism? What is it that we hold dear?
Uh, well, I think socialists are immensely optimistic or confident in progressive capacity of mankind. I don't think that that is a sort of empty or wishful thinking. It's demonstrated in history. The history of human society is the history of struggles for the creation of a better world, a more equal society. I would say that socialism, in terms of, if you want to define it in terms of values, equality is at the center of socialism. That is the abolition of classes, societies in which a handful of the population controls everything. Socialists strive for equality, social equality. We put it in our name. We think it's so central to socialism, the Socialist Equality Party. Um, and I think, though, that, I mean, socialism is fundamentally, first of all, the necessity for socialism arises out of the reality of capitalism. It's not just a sort of utopian wish or sort of a moral ideal. It's necessary. And this goes back to the writings of Marx. I mean, the scientific socialism, that capitalism in its historical development, as with other forms of social organization, reaches a certain point where it becomes a block on the further development of humanity. And again, you see this concretely in what is happening: global war, the irrationality of the whole economic organizations. It's impossible to move humanity forward without a new organization. So the necessity arises out of capitalism, and there is within capitalism a social force whose not just moral ideals, but social interests, class interests, lie in the establishment of socialist society. And this was the great advance of Marx, scientific socialism, that, and as opposed to utopian socialism, and going back to the writings of Marx as well as Engels, socialism, utopian and scientific, is still a very relevant work, where Marx explained that socialism isn't just something which is going to be implemented through the projects of individuals, or it's not just a ideal, it's embedded in the interests of a class in capitalist society, the working class, that class which produces everything but owns nothing, that is the source of all value, of all of society's wealth, but doesn't control that wealth, that is united in the process of production on a world scale. And Marx spoke about this, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, and what they identified so long ago is that at a much higher level today, that workers all over the world, which produce everything, united in the process of production, and their social interests lie. I mean, what is it that workers want, or but that people want? Healthcare, what necessary for modern life? Healthcare, education, a decent home, a job that pays a livable income, secure retirement, the ability to spend time with their families, the right to art and culture and everything else which modern society can provide but doesn't under capitalism. Well, the
So
the
can I ask
ability
you,
to, yeah.
sorry to jump in. Just want to, you made me think that, these things that are being appealed for by the Socialist Party, to any common sense listener, you would think that sounds amazing, right? Like, what bugs me is, why is it that the word socialism has such a bad rap in the United States? It's almost used as a dirty word by some people. Why do you think this has happened? Like, how do people come to realization? How does that change about this word socialism?
Well, I think first of all, it is changing. You know, polls themselves indicate that broad sections of young people, workers, have actually a positive view of socialism. But it's bound up some problems of consciousness within the working class and understanding of what socialism is, of course, bound up with history. Anti-communism, anti-socialism is the state religion of the United States throughout the 20th century. It was very much aided, the anti-communism of the American ruling class, very much aided by the reality of Stalinism and the false association of Stalinism with socialism. Our movement, the Socialist Equality Party, is part of an international movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist movement. Our history is the history of the fight against the Stalinist bureaucracy. Fourth International was formed in 1938 by Trotsky. The history of the Fourth International is the history, the Trotskyist movement is the history of the fight for genuine socialism against Stalinism, against various forms of nationalism. So these are historical questions which have to be clarified. But the ruling class spends immense resources to lie about what socialism is, to promote misconceptions, to disconnect American workers from the real history of socialism. Because the other point I would make in response to this is that there is a long tradition of socialism in the American working class. I mean, going back to all the struggles of the big major struggles of the working class were connected to the socialist movement. I mean, this Flint sit-down strikes in the mid 1930s, which formed the UAW, were led by socialists, by Trotskyists, in fact. So the history of the American working class is a history of class struggle, and very much directly bound up with the understanding within broad sections of the working class that their fight was against capitalism. So there's a necessity to reconnect the working class to that history.
Can I ask you so this is something that I've always struggled with, socialism. And it's not necessarily a struggle, but I'd be keen to hear your views on it. Where race fits into this. So many people are looking at what's going on in Palestine and linking it to decolonial struggle by the global South against a kind of a white supremacist West. People see race as an important factor in understanding why things are happening. So, what's your take on this? Is it a valid lens through which we should look at this? And if it is, then how is that compatible with the kind of the working? How does that interlace with the working class struggle? But yeah, what's your view? What's your view on the race dynamic?
Um, well, I think the basic question is class and not race, and it's not sort of white supremacy, which is driving U.S. policy, but imperialist geopolitics and the capitalist financial oligarchy. Now, racism and all forms of backwardness is promoted by the ruling class to divide workers against each other. I mean, you have in these elections Trump, who's really carrying out vicious fascist agitation around immigrants and refugees of a really racist character, all sorts of vile filth and anti-Muslim, anti-Arabic sentiment, which is promoted by the ruling class. But it's promoted by a class which is aimed, and the purpose is to divide the working class, to try to convince workers that their enemies are not the capitalists that are exploiting them, but other nationalities, races, etc. And the effort to understand politics in racial terms, I think, is wrong. I mean, if you raise the question of Ukraine and Gaza, for example, well, the issue isn't, I don't think, the different fundamental issues, the different race of those who are being targeted. The issue fundamentally is that in the case of Ukraine, the war is bound up with the imperialist interests, the war against Russia. They've used Ukraine as cannon fodder to carry out a war and escalate a war with the aim of dismantling Russia and getting access to its natural resources. In the case of Gaza, they're backing Israel in the genocide and a broader war in the Middle East. So what is involved is class interests in the different treatment of Ukraine and Gaza. But it's a single ruling class policy of war. I do think, just in relationship to this issue of race, because there is an effort very systematically to elevate the question of race as the fundamental issue. And this is particularly done by the Democratic Party, actually, in the United States. It's promoted on the campuses, somehow associated with left politics, although I would argue that it's in fact not left. And the argument is that the basic conflict in American society is racial, that the problem is white supremacy, white privilege, under conditions in which, in fact, the majority of the poor population in the United States is white. The majority, or the plurality of those killed by police even, is white. You have a white working class, a working class population, and those among those who are white, who are facing the same conditions of exploitation as their class brothers and sisters who are black or immigrant or whatever race and nationality. And so the sort of argument that, well, the problem is white supremacy really covers up the basic class issue. That it's not the supremacy of white people. It is in fact the rule of the capitalist ruling elite. And the white working class, all sections of the working class of all races, all genders for that matter, because there's also the promotion of sort of gender politics, which is aimed at arguing that the basic conflict is between men and women, or that the basic source of oppression is men rather than class. It's very consciously done in order to obscure the real source of exploitation and those who actually have power. I don't know if that
Really
is.
interesting. I mean, I just so you know, I see it as all of these things, and I find it very difficult to disentangle because often they are mutually reinforcing. I do see when we look at the history of colonialism in particular, and the justifications certainly driven by classist interests and the expropriation of resources. And you could see even in the UK during the British Empire, the abuse of the working class taking place. But on another, from perhaps a different perspective, it is feasible to say that there was an agenda that was based on white supremacy. But I do think it's really good to try to bring it back to the issue of class because of the reason I do come back to it is because of how prevalent it is to have brown and black people who are still nonetheless part of the elite black class war. So, forgive me for saying this, I'm not an American citizen and, maybe I shouldn't be butting in, but Barack Obama, right, presented as a black person and had a lot of charisma as a consequence of this association with the black struggle, but was nonetheless, the same way, part of that same elite club that has repressed other black people, other working people, and actually, in the end, hijacking the real struggle. And maybe that leads me on to another question, if I may. A lot of people have been following the Green Party as a alternative to the kind of duopoly, and myself included. There's a lot of statements made by the Green Party that I've appreciated as an outsider. Where do you see where do you see differentiations between yours and the Green Party, and what should people be a bit more cautious of in terms of understanding these differences?
Well, just first on Obama, I think that was an important experience. And I would, by the way, say that I don't think he had any relationship with the African American experience in the United States. His real background, I think, is more with the CIA and the intelligence agencies. But he was promoted as the candidate of change, of hope, and his race was, associated with that. And many actually white workers voted for Obama because they thought that, because of his background, that he would be more sympathetic to the oppressed. And what came out of that? President of war, the drone bomber in chief, the deporter in chief. Now you have them, they're trying to play out the same sort of, bring out the same sort of arguments or the same line in relationship to Kamala Harris, and it's having very little impact um, because there's been an experience with this. But I think it does go to the point that the issue is class and not race. And you have black CEOs, and you have women CEOs, and you have women senators, and perhaps presidents, and they serve the same class interests, and the policy continues. So I think it is a question, the fundamental, and this, of course, isn't to deny the existence of racism. Currently, historically, the utilization of those vicious forms of racism as part of colonialism, the British, the Belgians, of course, the Americans, to justify their slaughter and conquest of countries all over the world. But it is of course, that is used ideologically, but the actual driving force is social class interests, is control. I mean, what did Belgium want in the Congo? It wasn't white supremacy. They wanted access to the resources of the Congo. And the same applies for imperialism overall. Or what did the British want in India? There are all sorts of vile racism which they use, and also actually divide and conquer to pit Muslims against Hindus, which led to the disaster of the partition, promoted by the British imperialism to divide its colonial subjects. But what did it want in India? It wanted resources. It wanted, it was a source of profit for the British ruling class. So I say that the fundamental issue is class. Is social economic interest, which is at the root of society, production. But in relationship to the Green Party, well, I think it actually very much relates to these issues, because the perspective of the Green Party, if one wants to present it, I think most perhaps charitably to them, is that, well, we will either come to power if the Green Party wins office, or as a result of sufficient votes, will pressure the parties of the political system to shift their course. And if we were to come to power and become president or take office in different positions, we'll shift policy without addressing in any way the root cause, for example, of the genocide in Gaza. Jill Stein issued a statement recently where she said that her campaign was aimed at putting their feet to the fire. That is, that with a sufficient vote for the Green Party, the Democratic Party, or the politicians of either party would be forced to shift their positions. And that is, I think, fundamentally wrong. The response of the ruling class to opposition, in whatever form, is not to shift its policy. Actually, we have seen its repression. It is the moves towards ever more directly dictatorial forms of rule. There's been a year of mass protests against the genocide in Gaza, and it has had no effect on the policy of the Biden-Harris administration. And it doesn't address the root of the problem, which is capitalism. It doesn't seek and is not oriented towards the mobilization of the working class as a social force in opposition to the capitalist system. It promotes the illusion that somehow through the existing political institutions and without a fundamental reorganization of society, it will be possible to alter the policy. But as Lenin explained so long ago in his great work, Imperialism, written in the midst of the First World War, imperialism is not just a policy. It is an expression organically of the nature of capitalist society. Refer to it as the highest stage of capitalism. And so that is, as the basic difference. It is, I think, worth noting. Well, I'll make 2 points in relationship to the Green Party. One is that the Green Party came to power where it internationally, where it has achieved most political successes in Germany, where the Green Party first became became part of a coalition government in the late 90s. Its foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who had a background in various pacifist protests, environmental protests, opposition to the Vietnam War. And then he became foreign minister in an SPD-led government, and they led the German military on its first foreign intervention since the Second World War in the war against Yugoslavia. Baerbock is a member of the German Green Party now. She is also the foreign minister, and she just made a really vicious justification for targeting civilian buildings in Gaza. The Green Party in Germany is one of actually the most ferocious proponents of German imperialism. Now, of course, the Green Party in the United States says, well, we are not the Green Party in Germany, and we don't have any responsibility for their policies. But in fact, I think it speaks to the perspective.
Yeah.
That and the perspective is that somehow within the existing capitalist state, within the existing structures of the social economic order in which we live, it'll be possible to change policy. And the experience has demonstrated that those who actually come to power, and this is in a numerous form, not only the Green Party, but Syriza in Greece, Podemos. Syriza came to power in 2015 in Greece, claiming they were going to end austerity measures. It was going to be a major, shift in all of Europe, was the line. They then just implemented the austerity measures demanded by the IMF. They became a front line for Europe's anti-refugee policy. So the basic issue is, what is the orientation? And our perspective is there's not going to be a stop to this, a stop to the genocide, a stop to imperialism outside of overthrowing capitalism. And it's not an issue of holding their feet to the fire. It's an issue of the working class taking power itself and reorganizing society. And there's no way forward outside of that, because it is rooted in the capitalist system itself. Actually, sorry, the final point I just want to make about the Green Party is I did just want to acknowledge that Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, did endorse the campaign for the freedom of Bogdan Siratuk, and I appreciate her principled stand. He's a Ukrainian who's been arrested by the Zelensky government now for 6 months on trumped up false allegations. He's an opponent of the war. And I did just want to, while I'm politically criticizing the Green Party, acknowledge her statement, and principled statement calling for his freedom.
Well, that was excellent, excellent response to and very helpful because well, the election is coming, which is one method of expressing your political ambitions. But I think you really made the point well that it is not just an election, but we have to mobilize in societies to overthrow these systems, the capitalist, imperialist systems that are allowing this genocide to happen. And it won't be achieved simply through writing an X on a ballot box once every 4 years, but actually has to be regular holding to account of power, right? And I think that's hopefully a good way to wrap this up. So, where can American citizens vote for you, and how do they get involved in the broader struggle of the Socialist Equality Party?
Well, first of all, I just might say I don't think it's a question of holding account those in power, but of overthrowing those who are in power through the development of a movement in the working class for socialism. Um,
Right.
just want to make that point. Um,
Well,
but sorry, but where to find us? Socialism2024.org. You can also follow on social media and on the ballot. We're on the ballot in Michigan, uh, Washington, and New Jersey. We made the biggest campaign to get on the ballot in Michigan. I don't know how much your viewers are aware of the immense difficulties of third parties just to get on the ballot. We needed to get 12,000 signatures just to get on the ballot in Michigan. We got 20,000. Of course, a lot of opposition to the genocide in Gaza. In some states, it's basically impossible to get on the ballot unless you are one of the major parties. So we're on the ballot in those states. You can find out, and we also have write-in status in many states, socialism2024.org/vote. We have a full list where we're on the.
all right, awesome, Joseph. Thank you so much for this interview, and good luck. Good luck with the election, and good luck with the struggle. May
Thank you.
these.
Thank you very much for having
All right.
the discussion.